I've spent most of my life on the water. I grew up fixing outboard motors, learning wind patterns off a chipped pier, and falling asleep to the gentle slap of a hull against a buoy. I thought that knowledge made me safe, gave me a kind of practical faith in boats and tides and common sense. Turns out, the water only teaches you how little you actually know. These are 3 true boating stories that still live in my head, years later. They're not dramatized. I'm telling them the way they happened to me and to people I trusted. Each one starts ordinary: beers, bait, friends, and then something slips sideways. Things you can't file under rational without leaving a hole in the story. I'll give you the facts as I remember them. I'll tell you what we saw, what we smelled, what we did and didn't do. I don't claim to have answers. I only know how the not knowing sits in you afterward. The first one begins on an island we treated like our backyard. We had a private island that felt like someone had forgotten to populate it. It was small, 12 acres maybe, just enough trees and rock to be satisfying for teenagers trying to feel like explorers. It wasn't on any official map for us. It belonged to an old family whose property line pushed out into the lake and left that patch of trees between our shore and whatever the next landmark was. We called it the island, with the kind of possessive pride that comes from trespassing with friends and hot dogs over a fire. We'd go out there for day trips, for drinking until the sun slipped behind the tree line, for games, hide and seek, capture the flag, the dumb things you do to feel alive and to be seen by the kids you liked. There was one odd thing about the place nobody could explain. It felt dead, not literally, but in the way the woods were unnervingly quiet. No squirrels darted across the trail. Birds were scarce, and when you did hear something, it stopped as soon as you listened for it. That absence was part of the island's personality. We joked about it. We blamed coyotes, or the age of the oaks, or the town's cats. None of us were biologists. We were 17 and invincible, and certain that silence in the trees was just the lead-up to a party. Megan liked those quiet parts more than anyone. She was the kind of person who listened like she could catch secrets in a breeze. She'd stand at the water's edge and tilt her head like she was tuning static into a song. The first night we stayed over wasn't meant to be anything dramatic. Trevor, who always had that easy grin and thought every situation could be made better by a carton of marshmallows, suggested we camp. Rosie came too. She was Trevor's girlfriend and had a tendency to look like she wanted out of the woods at the same time she wanted to be the first to find something. I brought a cheap flashlight with a wobble in the beam and a thermos of coffee for the morning. Someone wore a Michigan State pullover by accident. It became a running joke. We packed extra blankets, a couple of fishing rods, and enough beer to make us forget we'd be responsible adults the next day. We set up near a small clearing that caught the wind just enough to keep the smoke from our fire from choking anyone. The sky was clear the whole night. The moon was low and made the lake look like a sheet of pewter. We ate. We told stories. We did that adolescent thing where one person pretends to be braver than they feel. At some point, Megan wandered away from the group. She didn't go far. I caught her shadow slipping between the trunks, and when I called her, she answered back, voice small, like she was listening to something only she could hear. We were in the middle of one of those half-funny, half-serious dares. Trevor had the flashlight, and because we were idiots, decided we'd play a version of hide-and-seek with a time limit. It was pitch dark beyond the circle of the fire, and the beam from Trevor's flashlight looked theatrical, cutting across trunks and underbrush. We turned off the speakers, and for a while the world narrowed to the crabbed light and the sound of our own voices. Then Megan said, "Listen." She wasn't playing. Her breathing changed. Every head turned. For a second there was only the rustle of leaves and the snap of embers. Then somebody laughed. Not one of us. It came from the trees, a thin, high laugh that might have been someone watching us and trying too hard to be part of the fun. The laugh wasn't close. It came from somewhere deeper in the woods where the dark kept secrets like a vault. Trevor swept the flashlight in a long arc, and for an instant the beam caught two bodies, standing where the trees grew denser. A man and a woman, both pale against the bark, eyes shining in the light like reflections. They looked like they had been waiting. Then, in maybe 3 heartbeats, they were gone. The beam kept moving, cutting the underbrush into silver and shadow, but there was no one there. We went quiet in the way that lets you hear a chipmunk breathe. The laugh came again, closer, threaded with the kind of breathless confidence people have when they're making mischief. Megan, who'd been looking at the spot the whole time, took a shaky step toward the trees. "They're in there," she said. We called out to them, at first jokey, then sharp. "Hey, come out!" Trevor tried to keep his voice unshaken, like we were doing normal teenage stuff. The sound answered us with leaves shifting and a rustle that might have been an animal. Someone else in our group, maybe me, flicked the flashlight to a strobe of panic, scanning trunks, low branches, nothing. Someone laughed again, but this time it sounded like right behind us, as if the voice had moved around the circle and then disappeared into a place you couldn't follow. Then a different voice, close and soft, said Trevor's name from the direction of the trees. "Trevor," the woman said. "Trevor, come here. I've got something cool." It was a voice like a neighbor who knows your dog's name. The sound was normal enough that your brain wanted to slot it into a harmless category. A kid from a nearby camp. Someone lost. Trevor's face changed the way a person's face does when they're offered something private and interesting. He took a step. He didn't shout. He didn't look back. "I'll be right there," he said. That's the sentence that haunts me. Casual, trusting, the kind of answer you give when you believe the world is not set on making you a lesson. I grabbed his arm. Simple, inexpert, maybe embarrassing. The physical act of holding someone back, of altering the course of a moment. He jerked, looked at me, and there was that quick, fatal spark in his eyes, like someone who doesn't think anything bad could come of a private adventure in the woods. "It's probably just Rosie messing with us," he said, smiling to make the tension a joke. I remember my mouth tasting of smoke and metal because of the adrenaline. I remember the impossible silence after that, like the island itself was holding its breath. I don't know why I pulled him back with more force than necessary. Maybe it was the way the woman's voice didn't quite belong to the space around us. A voice too polished, too bright. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe I was afraid of what Trevor would do if he walked into those trees alone. Whatever it was, I physically stopped him. He looked at me like I'd violated a pact of courage between us, and then he let it go. He obeyed the grab like a thing that had to be forgiven. We left soon after. We packed quietly, boots squelching, flashlights bobbing across roots, and the trees seemed to whisper behind us as if disappointed we were leaving a party. None of us slept much on the crossing back. When the island fell away behind us, what I remember most is the way Megan stared at the dark, like she had left something out there unfinished. The next morning, we went back with daylight and rationality like armor. We walked the perimeter in a wide circle, knives out for jangling branches, eyes on the floor for footprints or a discarded sweatshirt. It was embarrassing to be looking for evidence of anything supernatural, but we all wanted something to point at, something that made the night less like we'd imagined it on repeat. That's when we saw the stick figure. It was leaned against an old oak about 40 yards from where we'd camped. Not a drawing, but a crude human shape lashed together with twine and twigs. 2 arms, a torso, a head roughly rounded with a clump of moss for hair. It gave the impression of posture, like it was waiting with patient intent. Up close it was clearly handmade, assembled from saplings somebody had found and wrapped together with what could have been old fishing line or electrical tape. There was no note, no footprints leading to it. The ground around the tree was undisturbed. We stared at it in that weird communal silence where you let someone else fill in the disbelief. Trevor went white. "Who the hell made that?" Rosie whispered. and for a second it felt like a bad joke. We agreed that someone must have been screwing with us, maybe one of our own friends, maybe a stranger who liked creepy pranks. But nobody claimed it. No one from our circle admitted to spending the last night in the trees, weaving a human effigy. The thing about evidence is, it can point you in a direction, but it doesn't always tell you how it got there. The stick figure could have been left by kids from town, by someone who liked the occult, by a neighbor who practiced weird art with twigs. The simplest explanation is usually right, we told ourselves. But the simple explanation didn't sit right with us. The figure was too deliberate in the way it faced the water, like it had been waiting for a specific boat. We took pictures on our phones like reasonable people who needed to document proof for later. I can still see the small rectangle screen in my hand, the figure bright and silly, and absolutely not what our imaginations had created overnight. We left it leaned against the tree, like the island would keep it until it chose to release its meaning. I stopped going to that island after that, not because I was scared in a childish way, but because the place had a residue now, the after-smell of being on display for something I couldn't define. I felt guilty for that too. It was petty. I was a grown man, choosing not to return to a patch of land because it reminded me of being uncertain. But say that same thing to my chest at night, and it tightens as if someone has looped a hand over my ribs. A few months later, I drove past the shore and saw other kids pulling up in a beat-up truck, laughing, coolers clanking. They were headed toward the little dock. For a second I wanted to drive over and wave, to act like nothing had happened and prove that the island was just an island. But something in my chest told me to keep driving. The stick figure remained in my head like a splinter. A small, sharp thing that you don't want to touch because it will hurt more. That should have been the end of it. A private scare, an unresolved prank, a memory that sits in your head and doesn't tell you why it has to be there. We all went our separate routes to real life, college, jobs, slow adulting that makes supernatural concerns feel ridiculous. The quiet pressed down into the corners and life moved on. If that one made my skin crawl, wait until you hear what came next. Before I tell you the second story, a quick one. If you're into true maritime horror, hit subscribe. I got more of these, and honestly, it helps keep sharing them worth the trouble. The second story took place closer to home, right at the marina where I lived aboard my boat for a while. Living on a boat is like living with a slow-moving roommate who is indifferent to your emotional state. You learn to accept small inconveniences, like a leaky hatch or a refrigerator that hums like a nervous insect. The marina was small and practical, wooden slips, a coffee shop with 2 strong brew in the mornings, and the kind of regulars who liked each other without saying why. That community kept a person from feeling stranded at night. Buddy was one of the regulars. He wasn't his real name, but Buddy fit his demeanor, loose-lipped, always with a cigarette that he'd stub and then forget about. He showed up one late summer afternoon with a boat that didn't seem to belong in the marina. It was older than the others, the paint faded to a chalky blue, but what made it stand out wasn't the style. It was the smell. You know how certain smells land on you and refuse to leave? This one was like that. It hit you at the dock, even before Buddy pulled the lines tight, like someone had placed a bucket of wet hay and burned coffee under the cockpit. It was damp and sour in a way that made your nose wrinkle. Buddy laughed it off when someone mentioned it. "Old boats got smells," he said, smiling like a man who'd never been judged for much. He pulled his curtain closed tight and didn't invite anyone inside. He lived on that boat in a way he didn't live on land. Odd hours, coming and going at night, quiet pots clanking when the marina was asleep. People noticed the curtained windows, the way the boat sat a little lower in the water, as if it was carrying more weight than it should. Nothing illegal was ever obvious, just a general unease. When you live on the water long enough, you become sensitive to the things that don't sit right next to normal. That sensory intuition made you keep a friend at arm's length, like passing a plate. One night in late October, I was dozing in my berth when I heard a faint banging. It was the kind of noise that makes you sit up without thinking. a muffled, repetitive knock, as if someone was hitting the inside of a metal drum. I listened for a second, told myself it was nothing. Marinas creak, things settle, the wind has opinions. Then I heard a voice, a human voice, muffled through the hull and canvas. It was small, half-choked, like someone trying not to be heard. I couldn't make out the words at first, just the pattern. Knock, voice, knock. It felt like a sequence you should be able to decode if you weren't halfway to sleep. "Shut up," the voice finally said. It wasn't loud, it was controlled, like someone angered but using restraint. The single phrase had the kind of brutality that sits in a room and changes its air. Complete silence followed, as if the words had sucked the oxygen out of the marina. I sat up. The cabin light brushed the ceiling. My heart started, that low thud like the beginning of a long-forgotten panic. I told myself to be reasonable. Maybe the voice belonged to someone on the dock arguing about a break-in or kids messing around. Maybe I was imagining threat in the small hours, because that's what your brain does when you're alone. I put on boots and went out on deck. The air was sharp, carrying the skirl of a distant motor and the soft slap of someone else's hull against a piling. The smell hung heavy, the same wet, sour thing that had accompanied Buddy's arrival. I could see his boat through the marina lights, the canvas curtains flapping gently. The click of my flashlight felt loud against the quiet. I walked down the dock as far as my marina-minded courage would take me, and stood within range of Buddy's boat. The curtains were drawn tight, the kind that make a boat look like a closed shop. I knocked on his hull, the sound muffled by fiberglass. No answer. I ran my hand along the rail and felt the metal cool under my fingers, felt like one small proof of presence in a sea of otherwise anonymous craft. There was a bang from somewhere inside, not loud but sharp. And then silence. I considered calling the police. I considered 1,000 things in rapid fire. Report a suspicious noise, climb aboard and investigate, wake the other berth holders. I remember the exact order of the thoughts because I replayed them in the days after, like you replay a misplayed record. In the morning, Buddy was in his place by the dock. He had a cigarette hanging from his lip and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. When our eyes met, he stared a little too long through my cabin window, as if he was checking for something in me. "Night was rough," he said, voice casual. He left that afternoon. He didn't talk about the noise. Nobody asked. It's one of those social rules of marinas. People mind other people's business until the thing is obviously wrong. I never found out who, if anybody, had been on that boat the night I heard the voice. I never called the police then. That decision sat with me longer than I expected. I wrestled with what I should have done for months. That small personal guilt that growth sometimes accrues when you do nothing. Did someone need help? Was there someone being held on a boat with curtains drawn? Or was it nothing more than an argument, a fight that resolved itself before it needed my interference? You can spin both directions from the same evidence. I checked a few days later, poked around socially, asked other slip holders, offered coffee to anyone who would listen, and the picture remained fuzzy. Buddy left without fanfare, and a smell like old coffee and damp cloth lingered in my nostrils for the rest of the week. That kind of scent is good at staining memory. Even now, a certain cheap roast will put me back on that dock, heart thudding like a trapped thing. You learn to carry those small, gnawing things with you. Regret is like extra weight in your pockets. You don't notice it until you have to swim with it. I told myself I'd report something next time, that I'd be braver. But bravery isn't a steady currency. It's spent and saved, and rarely enough when you need it most. I told 1 or 2 friends about that night in a haphazard way, like you mention a cracked windshield. Most people said it sounded eerie, but shrugged it off. That's the thing about living with minor horrors. They're easy to minimize. It's discomforting, then forgettable, except for the way those moments accumulate. That night should have been self-contained, the voice and the bang and the man who left. But the marina had a way of collecting stories and letting them rub against each other. People who live around water build a tacit understanding. Not everything is cleanly explainable, and so you make peace with that. You also keep a ledger in your head of moments you didn't act on, and the ledger adds up. On a night a few weeks later, I woke to another sound, a soft scraping at my window, like someone using a fingernail to find a place to rest. I froze and waited because I had learned the way silent swallows sound down in marinas. The scrape stopped. A face more pale than human in the low light appeared for one fraction of a second, reflected in the glass. It was Buddy's face, if Buddy had decided to become a ghost. He stared. Then he turned and walked away. By the time I was down the ladder and toward the dock, his boat was gone. I kept thinking about the morning he left, about the way he'd looked through my window and tried on my face like a coat. I wondered, not with any evidence, whether he'd been watching us all along, whether he'd been waiting for us to notice, or whether that entire sequence was a string of coincidences, and my guilty conscience pieced them together out of boredom and fear. I still don't know. I didn't call the police that first night. I didn't make a report. Maybe I should have. Maybe someone was hurting and I missed a chance. Maybe somebody was carrying a small private crisis that had nothing at all to do with me. The point is, the ambiguity sits there, heavy and textured, a thing that changes the way you move through a dock at night. If that story hangs like a weight, stick with me, because the third one is where the ordinary and the desperate braid into something you can't easily set down. It begins on a day out with friends. Dustin, who loved the quiet hours of the morning, and Chris, who had a laugh that made people forgive him for lateness. We were out fishing, early sun on the water, rods clinking against the gunnels. It was the kind of day you remember for small, precise details. Coffee steaming in a paper cup, the scent of cut bait, the slow parade of other boats moving like lazy punctuation on the lake's surface. The kind of ordinary that makes you feel safe because nothing dramatic could happen when everything is so perfectly tranquil. That's when we saw the orange flag. It was fluttering against the yacht's stern, like an absurdly bright bird. In maritime terms, it's called a VDS, a visual distress signal, an orange rectangular marker meant to flag trouble. The yacht was big enough to be conspicuous, but not so big that it couldn't be ignored. It sat half a mile off, anchored awkwardly, and the way the flag bobbed felt wrong for a day like that. We cut the engine and drifted toward it because the rules of the lake are simple. If someone signals distress, you check. Approaching a boat at anchor is full of little decisions. You keep your motor idling, you watch for the faint eddies the hull makes, you scan for people on deck. From a distance, you could see signs that someone had been on board. A coffee mug steaming on a low table, muddy footprints on the teak where someone had tracked onshore scum, a pair of fishing rods still rigged and pointing like patient metal praying. Those are the specific items your brain flags as evidence, signs of life arranged like punctuation on an otherwise empty sentence. The yacht's hatch was open a crack. We called out, polite and loud. No answer. I eased the bow close, hopped over with the practiced awkwardness of someone who does this on weekends, and stepped onto the deck. Inside, it smelled different than any of the marinas I knew. Wet wool, something metallic, and again the faint aroma of a boiled coffee left to stand. The whole interior felt like a snapshot dropped into a moment. A folded towel on the galley rail, a half-gnawed sandwich on a plate, the television off, but the remote warm as if it had been in someone's palms. When you find evidence of ordinary life, and not the people themselves, an extra kind of wrongness settles on you. It's like walking into an empty theatre with popcorn still heating in a warmer. In the forward cabin, she sat. It's hard to describe someone who seems more like a broken puppet than a person without sounding cruel. But that's what I remember. A frail woman slumped in a chair with her head cocked at an angle that didn't look alive. Not dead, I wouldn't say that, but certainly barely there. A thin body as if it had been folded by time or illness into a smaller, easier shape. Her skin had that translucent sheen older people get, and her hands lay limply in her lap. At first I thought she was asleep, then I saw how her chest barely rose. She didn't respond when I called. When I touched her shoulder, light as a question, she started, and her eyes opened. Those eyes were the real thing that I cannot unsee. They were clear and bright for a second, then gone again. She looked at me like she was trying to locate something in my face and failing. Then she reached up with a surprising slowness and grabbed the orange flag. Not aggressively, not ashamed, almost precisely like a reflex. She moved it down, folded it with hands that did not quite obey her. She tucked it under cushions, with an economy that suggested she'd practiced the motion. I remember thinking, at the time, that she was hiding the distress signal. Why would anyone do that? Why sabotage the very sign meant to ask for help? The thought sat like a splinter. Someone else might have assumed she was confused, that she'd mistaken the sign for something private. I called out to my friends, told them to stay at the stern. I wanted to get a phone signal. I wanted clear-headed logic. I wanted the police. I wanted the woman to wake up and explain why she'd hidden a bright orange flag that meant help. When I stepped back out to the cockpit to get my phone and call it in, the yacht gone. I mean gone as in no anchor chain, no hull, no shadow on the water where it had been. The water had a calm patch where nothing was bobbing. For one ridiculous second I thought my eyes were playing tricks. A wave had taken it, an illusion. But the coffee mug was still steaming on the rail where I'd left it. I hadn't moved it. I hadn't touched it. I could have been wrong. I wasn't. We called the police once we finally got a signal, explained the flag, the woman who had hidden it, the vanishing boat. The dispatch officer asked for our coordinates and said they'd checked nearby channels. The official explanation came back slow and bureaucratic. No vessel reported, no sign on radar. Take a report and someone will follow up. By the time the authorities arrived, the yacht had vanished, as if lifted. All that remained was the impression oil leaves on the water and the faint circle where a hull had been. After that trip, a small cascade of odd things began to happen to us. Dustin lost a job he'd had for years. Chris's truck died inexplicably on a morning run and then wouldn't pass inspection despite how much they tried. I had a string of flat tires, each one on the highway and each one when I was alone enough with my thoughts to notice the pattern. Everybody joked at first, about curses, about being a magnet for trouble. We laughed because laughter is an effective denial, but jokes have a way of thinning out when the air gets cold. The more ordinary misfortunes stacked up, the less funny it all seemed. The boat's disappearance, the woman folding the flag as if it were a private thing, the steaming mug left behind like a clue to a missing scene. All of it stuck under our skin. I don't know why the woman hid the flag. Maybe she was lucid and ashamed for reasons we didn't understand. Maybe she was protecting someone who didn't want to be found. Maybe she was confused and hid it because the orange reminded her of a memory she preferred to bury. I can propose a dozen rational ideas, and none of them fill the blank space in the middle of the event. That's how this kind of thing gets under your fingernails. You can generate explanations, but none close the gap. There's a type of wonder that turns toward the dark after things like this. You start to see the world as a place where little anomalies point to larger mysteries. The stick figure on the island, Buddy's curtains and the muffled voice, the yacht and the woman with the motion of hiding distress. They don't line up neatly into a file labeled solved. They leave you with a ledger of near misses. Moments when a choice was made, then another person's choice erased the trace. That's where this first part of my story ends, with each of these events sitting in my head like loose pages from a book that someone has edited. They're real. They happened. They left evidence, a crude effigy, a smell that clung to a slip, a steaming coffee cup on an empty yacht, and they left choices I made or didn't make. These are the things I carry when I go out onto the water now. The memory of grabbing Trevor's arm, the echo of a voice saying, "Shut up," the image of a frail hand folding a distress flag. I could tell you what I think ties them together. I could tell you I believe in curses, or that some people are drawn to harmful situations like iron filings to a magnet. I could tell you that all of this is coincidence, chance, the mind connecting the dots to make a picture where none exists. The truth is, I don't know. What I do know is how precisely each moment lodged in me. The way the island felt wrong after we saw the stick figure, how the smell from Buddy's boat stuck to clothing like a rumor, how the yacht's steaming mug made ordinary life seem like a stage set. And I know one more thing. Being on the water changes the rules. You think isolation is physical. You're out past the docks, cut off by distance, but the isolation is also moral and temporal. Choices you make there have the weight of being done where fewer witnesses exist. That makes decisions feel heavier. It makes guilt press differently against your chest. So I stopped sleeping the way I used to. I started noticing details with a new edge, and when the marina hummed at night, I listened harder than I cared to admit. The next part of this story, what happens when you take that heaviness and try to look for answers, starts with a phone call I didn't want to receive and ends with me deciding whether to follow a trail that probably wasn't mine to follow. The phone rang at 2 in the morning. I saw the number flash, and for a second my chest closed like a fist. I didn't want that call. You learn, after a while, what certain rings mean. Late bills, drunk friends, someone dead. This one was neither obvious nor simple. It was the harbour master. His voice had that careful, low rhythm people use when they're trying to keep themselves from sounding alarmed. "We hauled something up on the bow of a derelict off the North Channel," he said. "Thought you might want to see it." I remember laughing, stupid and too loud for the hour. "A lobster trap? A beer cooler?" He didn't laugh. "Just come down." By the time I got down there, the sky was lightening to that thin, pewter blue that makes your headlights look like candles. The marina smelled like the usual, diesel, salt, the sour edge of old rope. But there was another hint that shouldn't have made sense that early. A faint smell of coffee, stale and sharp, like the ghost of a mug that had been left too long on a tiny galley stove. It hooked into the part of my brain that refused to let the yacht go. He met me by the rail, broad-shouldered and practical, with hands that had evidently tightened many knots. "Found it tangled in an old trawl," he said, and gestured at a bucket. Inside lay a small thing wrapped in webbing and slime. When he eased it free, I could see the outline, twigs lashed together with frayed fishing line. A miniature human, a stick figure maybe a foot tall. Moss clung to one shoulder like hair. Someone had tied it up with the same sickly tape I remembered seeing on the island. Not identical, but close in that way that makes coincidence feel nudged. He passed it to me like it was an object that could be handled without consequence. The twigs were damp. The smell of wet earth rose off it. I could still see the memory of the larger stick figure planted on the island, face toward the water, patient, as if it expected an arrival. I set the little one on the railing, and it looked ridiculous and menacing at the same time, a child's craft with an adult's intent. "Been seeing bits of this for a few months," the harbour master said. "Old fishermen bring nets in, sometimes there's rope, sometimes not much. But last week we pulled up a scrap of orange fabric caught on a buoy. Looked like VDS material." He tapped at his tablet and showed me a photo, a tatty sliver of orange that could have been anything, unless you knew the right thing to look for. I knew. It felt like the echo of that steaming mug on the yacht, the orange flag tucked away under cushions. He'd been slow to call because he wasn't sure what he wanted me to do. Call the police? Turn it into paperwork? He'd thought of younger men, bored and drunk, making a tableau for laughs. He'd thought of kids with too much time and a taste for the uncanny, all plausible, all unsatisfying. "Why me?" I asked. "Because you live on the water, because you know the island, because you asked when the yacht went missing," he shrugged. Because sometimes people want someone who'll look a little harder. We talked in the thin light while the marina woke up around us. Boats yawed on lines. A kid from the coffee shop lit a cigarette, crushed it out, and tried not to stare. I called Dustin and Chris on the way back to my truck. Their voices were rough with sleep, then alert when I explained what had been pulled up. We agreed to meet at the harbour office at 9, to look through the harbourmaster's logs and see whether anything actually concatenated, or whether we were just connecting scraps into a story we wanted to be true. There are two kinds of people who chase patterns, those who need an explanation and those who need a problem solved. I was both that morning. Guilt made the pattern sticky. Curiosity made it sharp. At the office, the logbooks were those old institutional things with pen marks and grease stains, names, times, odd notes in the margins, drifted stern line, no owner, vessel at anchor, no response, tarp removed from skiff. A slow, bureaucratic landscape of little incidents where nothing had become a thing. One entry from 2 months earlier caught my eye. Unidentified small effigy found on mooring 8, disposed. Admoored by what? Which marina? The handwriting matched the harbour-master's, and his mouth went thin. "We toss a lot of debris," he said. "We don't have the staff to file everything, and I don't want to be the harbour that hoards oddities." We searched the local forums next because that's where the town kept its unclassifiable moments. People post faded photos of unusual tides, beer can collections, dogs doing tricks. Buried under a thread about trash on the shores, I found a low-resolution photo 2 summers back. A stick figure, much like ours, propped against a breakwall at a different shore. The poster had captioned it, "Weird thing on the rocks. Anyone know?" One commenter wrote, "Seen that before," and nothing else. A dead air of dismissal followed. People had seen it and moved on. Dustin ran a hand through his hair, annoyed and a little frightened. "This could all be place-based," he said. "Maybe some local is making art out of drift. Some weirdo. It doesn't mean anything criminal. Maybe the rational ones in us lined up like soldiers." But then Chris, who seldom loses his temper, said, "What about the yacht? The woman who folded the flag? What about that steaming mug? How many coincidences do you string together before it's not coincidence?" We argued in that small, honest way friends do when they're uncomfortable. Not to solve things, but to distribute the guilt. I wanted to be practical. I wanted evidence. I wanted someone official to call this a pattern and start doing paperwork. The harbour-master gave us an address, the name of a small boathouse complex down the river where driftwood and cast-offs sometimes accumulated. "People without boats sometimes hang out there," he said. "They make things." We drove there with a plan that was equal parts curiosity and cowardice. The boathouse sat half hidden by reeds, weathered boards and a sagging sign. The air near it had a sweetness of old seaweed and gasoline. An old dog barked in the distance. We moved quiet, not because we were hiding, but because the place made quiet feel necessary. Inside were small constructions, nets filled with shells, a child's plastic rake turned into something ornamental, a row of dinghies upended like ribs, and in a corner, beneath a tarp, another stick figure. Larger than the one the harbour-master found, but smaller than the island's effigy. Twine, tape, moss. Someone had arranged it so it watched the entrance. A coffee filter, stained with brown, lay beside it like a discarded prop. My hands trembled when I picked up the coffee filter. It smelled faintly of roasted beans, not the same as the yacht, in the way a fingerprint differs from a smear, but suggestive enough to make the skin on my arms prickle. There were more artifacts. A torn scrap of orange material pinned to a board, tiny photographs tacked up, grainy images of shorelines and boats, nothing conclusive, a series of moments someone had wanted to keep. That was when we realized this wasn't random. Someone had a theme, someone who made small human figures and took pictures of places, who kept bits of orange cloth and coffee filters like tokens in a shrine. They'd left a line, a breadcrumb trail, and for reasons I still couldn't fully name, I wanted to follow it. There was no sign of anyone when we were there, no footprints leading away that weren't overgrown with years of neglect. But we found a smear on the door jamb, a brown, oily smudge that could have been coffee, could have been something else. It was ridiculous how much weight we gave that smear. The human brain is a cheap decorator. It will string flimsy things into patterns because it prefers a story to a pile of facts. "Maybe this is his guilt," Dustin said, and pointed at me, smiling in the way men do when they try to make a joke out of their fear. "You pulled Trevor back. Maybe you were meant to pull a few more people back from something." It landed wrong. I didn't know how to answer. I thought of Trevor's easy trust under the trees. I thought of the woman folding the flag on the yacht. The images paraded through my head like trial marks. We took photos, of course. We logged everything in our phones and gave the harbour master a heads up. He asked if we wanted him to notify the police. We hemmed and hawed. We told ourselves we were doing this for evidence. We told ourselves we didn't want to make anyone a suspect without cause. We told ourselves the police would be friction, paperwork, waiting rooms, the slow blade of procedure. What we didn't tell each other was the part that kept us moving. Curiosity is both a noble motive and a selfish one. We wanted to know what was behind the curtain, and we wanted to be the ones to find it. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in my berth counting the soft creaks of the hull and thinking of small things. The way the island's stick figure faced the water. The way Buddy had looked through my window that one morning. The frail woman's hands moving like a practice motion to hide a bright, impossible signal. The connections blurred. I imagined a person living a half-life along the water, making these figures and then shifting them like a child's game. I imagined someone who hated attention and yet arranged things specifically so others would notice, a private performer leaving public clues. I imagined someone else entirely, random, cruel, or in need. None of the images fit cleanly. The next morning, a man I had only seen once at the marina called. He sounded thin and anxious. "You ever hear of a place called Crane Hollow?" he asked without greeting. I did. Small inlet, shallow, surrounded by pines that drop needles like confetti. "Yeah," I said. "Why?" "There's a woman living there," he said. "Old boat at the mouth. Folks say she talks to the water. They say she hides orange cloths." He laughed, a brittle sound. "Sound familiar?" I told him about the yacht, the woman, the flag. He told me a story about a woman whose husband had drowned years ago. He told me about a life made small. He told me things you only tell when you think no harm will come from them. Stories, rumors, pieces that may or may not be true. He promised to keep an eye and then hung up. You learn quickly on the water to treat stories as both maps and traps. A story can be the only road you have. It can also be a maze someone put up to keep you wandering. I thought about Crane Hollow and the way the island felt like a place that didn't want to be touched. Would I drive out there? Should I? Who had the right to step into the private life of someone who might be ill, ashamed, or simply living differently? Ethics arrive late in these things. They sit with you while you weigh whether curiosity is a benefit or a theft. If the woman on the yacht had been hiding a flag out of shame, perhaps she had reasons. Perhaps she